In the 1920s, the traditional boundaries of social and religious customs were flouted when people became less concerned with living religious lives centered around the church and more concerned with material fulfillment. Morality was affected both by an increase in women's rights and by psychology publications that many Americans attempted to understand and interpret. The psychological studies of Sigmund Freud and other European psychologists became very popular among American people. A sexual liberation occurred when psychology justified increased sexual activities in America. A revolution in morals occurred in America in the 1920s due to increased women's rights and the public support of Freud's theories on psychology. As sex became glorified, it became a popular theme in society that challenged traditional views and rooted itself in much of America's society, culture, and arts. Women began to defy the traditional male-dominated society in the 1920s. By the end of the 1920s, women had gained considerable new independence in politics, some independence in economics, and the most independence in society. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, and some women were elected to public office. They began to participate more in their communities by using their new voting power. Women also gained new economic independence in the 1920s, as more women became employed after working during World War I, and as clerical work positions became jobs for women. In 1900, there were 86,000 women employed in clerical positions, and by 1920, over 775,000 were employed in the same jobs. Women gained the most independence in social life, as their economic independence led women to become increasingly assertive in their marriages at home, controlling factors such as birth control, reproduction, and divorce. Women gained greater freedom in politics, economics, and social life, as traditional values became overshadowed by new women's rights. Although women gained many new rights and independence, traditional and conservative views kept many women in the private sphere of life. Upon the ratification of the 19th Amendment, many reformers such as Elizabeth Cary Catt expected that the vote for women would solve inequality and the difference of treatment between men and women. To their disappointment, many women did not take full advantage of their new voting rights, citing the reasons that they did not believe in women's suffrage, they still believed in separate public and private life, or that they simply forgot to vote. Economically, women were still being paid far less than their male counterparts and were mostly employed in a narrow range of clerical jobs. If a married woman decided to work, it was not for the cause of increasing women's equality to men, but rather for increasing the family income. The 1920s introduced new independence in society for women, although this new independence was constantly challenged by lingering traditional and progressive era ideals. When women gained more independence, more stress was put on marriages. Since women were able to economically sustain themselves, divorce became a viable option for women in unhappy marriages. Other factors contributing to divorce were that both partners were seeking others of increasingly higher standards, and women were no longer willing to accept being in a miserable marriage. As a result, divorce rates rose to over 205,000 per year by 1929. Child-rearing was also approached differently in the 1920s. Dr. John B. Watson's book, Behaviorism, which explained the idea that man was an indifferent being that responded to stimuli, offered an approach to raising children that involved no affection in order to raise them to be disciplined and obedient. The book became so widely popular in America that the government even included rigid scheduling for raising children in its best-selling pamphlet, Infant and Child Care. Domestic relationships were put under strain when women gained more independence and new methods of raising children emerged that challenged older child-rearing approaches. Morals in the 1920s were affected most by European psychological publications. When the Viennese psychiatrist Sigmund Freud first lectured in the United States during 1909, his works explaining his sexual theories that neurotic symptoms could be traced to sexual disturbances became widely popular with the American public. By the end of World War I, the country had become Freud conscious. Over 100 psychologists served on the Surgeon General's staff, and publications emerged that incorporated psychology into aspects of daily life, such as golf and selling life insurance. One reason that Freud's theories became widely popular was that people accepted what they read as simple ideas that were able to be easily grasped, when in fact the ideas of Freud's theory and psychoanalysis were extremely difficult to fully comprehend and required years of background study. In other words, Americans in the 1920s were addicted to fast Freud and grew dependent on distorted psychology as justification for increased sexual activities. Freud's theories, when distorted by the American public, gave people a scientific excuse to have sex. It was considered damaging to one's health if he or she did not freely and frequently have sex. Psychiatry aimed at giving men and women more control over their actions through a better understanding of their impulses. Since many Americans understood this basic concept, the American environment fostered this rapid, optimistic growth of psychiatry. After women gained more independence in social life and Americans established the idea that sex was good, American society became obsessed with sex. Novels such as Jargon were written heavily incorporating the subject, magazines written about the subject rapidly gained popularity, and sexual themes were even present in new songs, such as Hot Lips and Burning Kisses. Newspaper tabloids emerged with the glorification of sex, and movies were especially affected. When the movie industry was threatened with censorship bills from 36 states, the movie industry leader Will Hayes considerably toned down sexual themes in movies. As the popularity of sex rose, taboos of sexually related conversation dropped. Sex also became a common subject in youth society, since parental control of sex was considerably lessened. New dances set to jazz music, such as the foxtrot, stirred up controversy with moralists for the new, provocative nature of the dances. Consequences of changed morals in the 1920s. More contraceptive techniques were used, and fear of pregnancy was lessened. As casual sex increased, prostitution lessened, and many brothels shut down. As a result of popularized sex, girls became extremely self-conscious of their figures and strove to be thin. Flappers emerged. They refused to recognize the traditional American moral code. There was a well-defined break between generations. Young World War I veterans could not relate their experiences to elders, and young women no longer modeled themselves on their mothers. Instead of youth emulating age, age imitated youth. Young girls started the flapper fashion, but it was their mothers who perpetuated it. The country insisted on immediate gratification, and people lived during the 1920s in the here and now. The 1920s saw an increase in women's rights through the 19th Amendment, increased economic independence, and increased influence in marriages and domestic functions. Rising amounts of stress were put onto marriages, and divorce rates greatly climbed. Psychology became very popular with the American public in the 1920s, especially the sexual theories presented by Sigmund Freud. As people accepted and distorted many difficult psychoanalysis ideas, it quickly became a well-supported subject in America and was integrated into American literature and other areas of its culture. Freud's sexual theories were used by the American people as scientific justification for increased sexual activities, and the subject of sex rapidly expanded to many parts of society. Traditional morals were cast aside as sex integrated itself into American entertainment, marketing, and social life.